Adam Einstadt is a longtime professional writer. He grew up in Pittsburgh, and a short while ago he wrote an article about being 12 years old and needing to raise money for his Little League team. He lived in a very affluent neighborhood of Pittsburgh, and most of the parents just gave their kids the money, but his did not. So off to the neighbors he went to solicit support. He spent most of the day knocking on doors, and he wrote that not a single person really cared about what he was doing or why he was doing it. Finally, at the end of the day, he approached a house of a famous TV star, someone he never liked his show. He thought he was corny and dull. When he rang the doorbell, this famous person was gracious and approachable. He invited this 12-year-old boy into his house, and the boy was quite surprised when the older TV star that he had no use for really listened to him and asked him all kinds of questions about what he was doing and what was important to him. So in his article, Einstadt wrote about this experience, and he wrote, "After that, I couldn't think of Mr. Rogers as being anything but authentic." Authentic. The 12-year-old boy experienced authentic caring, interest, concern, and love of one's neighbor. You might know that Mr. Rogers was a Presbyterian minister, and he definitely caught the basic message of Jesus Christ that we hear in the gospel this weekend. Love your neighbor. Young Adam thought that Mr. Rogers was corny and soft, but he changed his mind when he met him. And he came to realize that what David Brooks wrote about Rogers in the New York Times was true when Brooks wrote and described Mr. Rogers as ferocious, brave, and radical. That he based his career on his horror of what he saw happening and going on in television and in the world around him, and that he was outspoken about it his entire life. Brooks, in his article, described him as being fed up. Well, you know, Jesus could be described in the same way. He was ferocious, brave, radical. He based his life on being fed up with the society of his day in their lack of love for their neighbor. That was his basic message. And this core message is what brings us together here every Sunday. This is the central point of our faith as Catholic Christians. This is what we are all about. It boils down to the challenge we hear from the gospel this weekend. It's all about how we treat one another. And as we come together this weekend, we hear this message after a rather sobering week in our nation. Last Saturday, while celebrating the Sabbath, our Jewish brothers and sisters at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh were gunned down. It has been called the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in the history of the United States. The gunmen entered the synagogue shouting, "All Jews must die." And we as Christians gather this weekend being challenged to love our neighbor. And Jesus does not qualify who our neighbor is. Remember the character, friendly Officer Clemens? Well, for over 25 years, Francois Clemens played this role. He was the first black actor to have a recurring role on a children's TV series. And Fred Rogers was clearly going out on a limb to cast Clemens as a police officer. And over the decades that he spent on the show, there's one scene in particular that Clemens remembers with great emotion. It was from an episode that aired in 1969 in which Mr. Rogers was resting his feet in a plastic pool on a hot day. And Clemens wrote, "He invited me to come over and to rest my feet in the water with him." That icon, Fred Rogers, not only was showing my brown skin in the tub with his white skin as two friends, but as I was getting out of that tub, he was helping me dry my feet. He was helping me dry my feet. Doesn't that remind us of a scene in the Last Supper where Jesus wipes the feet of his apostles and he says, "Go and do the same"? This is the basic Christian message. If we're going to be authentic Christian Catholics, we must all be fed up with all that we see going on in society today that belittles and abuses any human being. We must be fed up with all the hate speech that we hear on TV and in our politics. Because each one of us is called to soak our feet in the basins with our neighbor, whoever the neighbor might be. Jew or Muslim, black, red, yellow, white, gay or straight, religious or atheist, poor or rich. We are called by this man we say we are committed to dry the feet of all human beings. This is our core. We can be angry at the institution for all of its flaws, but the institution isn't what makes us Catholic Christians. It's living out the core message of Jesus as Mr. Rogers did. Tonight we also come together in remembrance this weekend, where we invite back families of our departed brothers and sisters in our parish of this past year. This is also what it means to be an authentic Christian, that we reach out to all who are suffering or in pain or grieving, and we share their grief, we share their sadness, whoever they might be. We live in a society today that seems to be filled with prejudice, division, and hate. The institutions that are supposed to give us guidance have failed us. Thus, we cannot depend upon the institutions to guide us. We must depend upon the message of the one we say we place all of our trust in, and we say who gathers us together every weekend. It's the message we just heard read. Love your neighbor. Given to us by a radical Jewish preacher 2,000 years ago. This is what we're called to believe in. This is what we're called to give our lives to. This is what must be at the core of our belief system, not our very fallible leaders, whether in church or government. So as we come together to worship this weekend, let us truly hear the words of Jesus lived out in such a refreshing way by Mr. Rogers. Let us all struggle to be authentic, to hear the call to dry each other's feet, and be in solidarity with all those people who are treated poorly and abused, and especially these days with our Jewish brothers and sisters.